I still remember the sound of it. Not the scream, not the shatter of silence, but the way my breath froze in the air before I moved. It was 2 in the morning in Burlington, Vermont, and the snow outside was so quiet it almost dared the world to stay asleep. Then I heard my son Ethan scream from down the hall. It was not a tired whimper or a sleepy moan. It was a sound that ripped straight through me. I ran without thinking. I did not even feel the floor beneath my feet. When I reached his room, the door was half open. My stepmother Vivian stood in the doorway as if she owned the night. She was 56, but her face in that moment looked carved from ice. Her hand still clutched a pillow like she had just adjusted it, like she was trying to look innocent. Ethan lay on the floor near his bed, his small arm twisted in a way no child's arm should ever be. His eyes were wide with pain. His cheeks were white as the snow outside. No sound came out of him now, only the sharp gasps between sobs. Vivian smirked. Not a nervous smile, not shock. A smirk. Her voice was cold and clear. He deserved it. Maybe now he will learn respect. The world tilted sideways. I froze in the doorway with the kind of stillness that does not belong to this world. I remember the smell of the old radiator, the way the streetlight fell through the window. I remember my son's hair sticking to his damp forehead, and I remember the way her voice did not shake. She believed what she said. She stood there as if this was discipline, as if she was proud of it. My knees hit the floor next to Ethan. I touched his face with shaking hands and whispered his name. His body trembled against mine. I did not look at her. I could not. I pressed my forehead to his and said his name over and over like a prayer. I grabbed my phone with one hand while holding him with the other. The 911 operator answered on the second ring. My voice was shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. "It's my son. His arm is broken. Please come fast." She asked me questions I could hardly hear. I gave the address. I told her my son could barely breathe through the pain. She said help is coming. I remember the click of the line and how loud my heartbeat sounded afterward. When I turned my head, Vivian had walked calmly into the living room. She sat on the sofa like someone who had finished wiping a table. She crossed her legs and sipped the cup of chamomile tea she had left waiting for herself earlier that night. No panic, no fear, just quiet satisfaction. My father, Robert, stepped out of his bedroom, his hair disheveled, his eyes narrow with irritation, not worry. "What happened?" His tone was flat tired. She looked at him and said, "He fell." Kids are clumsy. I stared at her and knew this moment would carve itself into me forever. The sirens came faint and distant at first, the kind that slide under your skin before you even register them. I held Ethan tighter as if holding him could fix what she had done. I looked at her sitting on that sofa. Her legs crossed to the cup in her hand, the smirk still faint on her lips. I understood something then. This was not a mistake. This was a message. She wanted me to see that she could hurt what I loved most and walk away as if nothing had happened. When the lights flashed red and blue across the living room, she did not move. She just straightened her sweater. I walked out of Ethan's room carrying him in my arms. He was shaking from pain and shock, his face pressed against my shoulder. I whispered, "It's okay, baby, it's okay," over and over, though nothing about this night was okay. The front door opened, boots on snow, radios crackling. My world had changed forever, and so had hers. If this was your child, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. August of 2024 was the month when the cracks first began to show, though at the time I convinced myself they were nothing more than tension from a new marriage. My father Robert had remarried in late July. The wedding was small, tasteful, and painfully quiet, like an event where everyone pretended to smile. I watched him stand beside Vivian as she gave her rehearsed laugh for the photographs. There was something in the way she held her posture, her shoulders squared a little too tight, her smile drawn too perfect, like someone who was not marrying for love but for control. I brushed it off. I told myself I was being unfair, that I just needed time to adjust. Ethan, who had turned 7 that summer, clutched my hand at the reception and asked if we could go home early. He never liked loud rooms. I told him we would stay a little longer for Grandpa, because that is what you tell a child when you are trying to keep a family from unraveling. The first few weeks after they returned from their honeymoon, Vivian's presence was like a draft in an old house, cold but easy to ignore at first. I was working night shifts at University of Vermont Medical Center. As a nurse in the ER, my hours were unpredictable, so Ethan sometimes stayed overnight with my father and Vivian. I told myself this was good, that he would have more time with his grandfather. But every time I picked him up in the morning, his smile was smaller. He grew quieter, less eager to tell me about the little things that had happened overnight. It began with the small, poisonous comments. She would say things like, "Boys need to toughen up," in that breezy tone of hers, as if it were just common sense. Or, "He is a sensitive one, isn't he?" Almost like an apology to the air. She never said these things directly to me at first. She said them when she thought I was not listening, said them loud enough for me to hear anyway. When she spoke to Ethan, there was always that undercurrent of disdain. Not obvious, not enough to scream at her over, just a slow, dripping leak. One morning in early September, Ethan came down the stairs with his favorite t-shirt on, the one with the faded dinosaur print, and Vivian said, "That shirt looks messy." "We are not animals." She poured her coffee like nothing had happened. Ethan froze in the hallway, not understanding why a shirt could make someone look less than human. That was the first time I saw it in his face, confusion mixed with shame. My father pretended not to notice. He was 62, tired, and wanted peace more than anything. When I mentioned the comment later, he sighed and rubbed his temple. "Clara, she is just old-fashioned. She will come around." But she never came around. Her words got sharper. She would say, "My niece would never act like that," or "I do not want this house turning into a playground." She always made it sound like Ethan was a visitor, not family. The first real fight happened in late October. I arrived at their house after a double shift. Ethan was at the kitchen table coloring. Vivian stood at the counter with her arms folded, tapping her nails against the wood like a metronome of irritation. She said he had spilled juice on the floor earlier, that he had not cleaned it fast enough. I saw no spill. She had already cleaned it up but decided to lecture him anyway. She said, "You are too soft on him. A boy needs discipline." I told her that lecturing a 7-year-old for spilling juice was absurd. She lifted her chin and said, "He is not my responsibility. You should have thought about that before." Before what I asked, but she only smirked. The shift was slow but steady. By winter, she no longer bothered to hide her resentment. She called Ethan stubborn when he did not finish his dinner fast enough. She told me he needed to toughen up because the world was not kind to weak boys. The words, "weak boys," stuck with me like splinters. My father tried to stay out of it. He would pat Ethan on the head, offer him a cookie, and tell him to be a good boy. He never told Vivian to stop. He never told her she was wrong. He wanted his second marriage to work more than he wanted to protect his grandson. That realization would come to burn later, but at the time, I kept convincing myself it was temporary. In November, she started setting little rules for Ethan. No toys in the living room, no cartoons during dinner, no snacks without asking her first. None of it seemed big on its own, but together it began to choke the air out of him. One night, when I came to pick him up, I found his favorite stuffed rabbit in the trash. She said it was too childish for a boy his age. I pulled it out and brushed it off. Ethan stood in the corner of the kitchen silent, as if speaking would get him in trouble. She always had a way of making cruelty sound like logic. I started sleeping less. Working nights meant I was already stretched thin. Now I was replaying her words during my breaks, wondering what she might say or do while I was gone. Ethan started clinging to my sleeve every time I dropped him off. Sometimes he whispered, "Do I have to stay?" and I would lie to him. I told him it was just for a little while, just until things settled. But things never settled. I began to record some of her comments quietly on my phone. I told myself it was just in case. In case what I did not know yet. Maybe in case I ever doubted myself. Maybe in case this quiet creeping poison ever became something worse. It was not a single explosion that changed everything. It was months of small cuts. She never raised her voice. She did not need to. She knew how to press down on a bruise until it hurt without leaving a mark. And my father let her. By the time the first snow fell that year, Ethan had stopped asking questions. He moved around their house like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. I told myself I could handle it. I told myself I was stronger than her. I told myself she would never cross a line she could not come back from. Winter of 2025 came with a quiet kind of cold, the kind that makes sound carry too clearly through the walls of a house. My apartment was under renovation that December, a project that was supposed to take 4 weeks but stretched into months. I did not have many choices. The only place Ethan and I could stay without draining every dollar I had saved was my father's house. I told myself it was temporary, that I could handle a few months under Vivian's roof. I had no idea then how much control a person can exert without ever raising their voice. The first night back in that house felt off. Vivian had arranged the dining room like a showroom, the table perfectly set, every chair aligned with military precision. She informed us dinner would be at 6 sharp every evening, not a minute later. I remember laughing lightly, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. That first week, she made it clear that in this house, her word was law. She started with rules about how Ethan should address her. She insisted he use "yes, ma'am" when speaking to her. If he didn't, she corrected him sharply in front of everyone. Ethan, who had never been forced to speak like that in his own home, began hesitating before every answer, as if searching for the right code. She monitored his posture at the table, corrected how he held his fork, commented on how much he ate, and criticized the way he leaned back in his chair when he was tired. I watched him shrink a little more each night. By mid-December, she added television rules. No TV until all his chores were done. No cartoons at all on weeknights. If he forgot to push in his chair or didn't say "yes, ma'am" fast enough, the TV stayed off for the rest of the night. It was never about the television. It was about control. Vivian liked to measure her power in small, calculated doses. She wanted to see how far she could push before anyone pushed back. Ethan started spending more time in his room. The boy who used to chatter about dinosaur facts and draw superheroes on every scrap of paper grew quiet. He tiptoed around her like the house itself might explode if he moved too loudly. At night, when I tucked him in, he clutched his stuffed rabbit against his chest, the same one she had thrown in the trash a year before. I had sewn up its ear after that. He whispered questions he didn't dare say out loud during the day. Why does she hate me? Did I do something wrong? Every time I told him the same thing. You did nothing wrong. But each night it was harder to believe those words had any power. Vivian kept tightening her grip. She began controlling what Ethan wore in the house. She didn't like t-shirts with cartoon prints. She said they looked sloppy. She told him to wear the plain shirts she had bought. When he protested quietly, she told him boys who disobeyed grew up useless. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was enough. My father watched all this unfold with that same weary look he had carried since their wedding. He never told her to stop. He said things like, "Clara, don't make everything a battle," or, "She means well." I think those words will haunt me forever. He wanted peace, but peace bought with a child's silence is not peace. It's surrender. One night in January, after Ethan had gone to bed, I walked downstairs for a glass of water. The house was quiet, except for the sound of Vivian's voice in the kitchen. I stopped halfway down the stairs when I heard her say, "That boy's a mistake. She should have left him with his father." My father didn't say a word. He just sighed a long, tired sound. Then he said, "Let's not fight about this." She laughed softly like someone who knew she'd already won. My hand tightened around the railing. I didn't make a sound. I stood there in the dark and listened. That was the night something inside me shifted. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of Ethan's bed. He was asleep, breathing softly, his small hand resting against the rabbit's torn ear. I made a decision I didn't even realize was forming. The next morning, I downloaded a simple voice recorder app on my phone. I slipped it into my pocket during dinner. When she told Ethan he had to finish his vegetables before speaking again, I recorded her voice. When she told him his laugh was too loud, I recorded her voice. When she said boys who didn't show respect end up like their useless fathers, I recorded her voice. It became a quiet ritual. I didn't know what I would do with the recordings. At that time, I only knew I needed proof that what I felt wasn't just in my head. Vivian had a way of making people doubt themselves. She had done it to my father, and now she was trying to do it to me. As the weeks passed, her control spread like frost over everything. She began rearranging Ethan's room, taking away the toys she didn't approve of, saying a boy his age should learn to be neat. She decided when we could use the laundry room, what foods were acceptable, how loud the TV volume could be. Nothing was left untouched. She never hit him. She didn't have to. Her power came from the way she made him feel like every part of himself was wrong. I started to feel it too. I began walking quieter in the hallway without realizing it. I checked the clock before speaking, wondering if I was breaking one of her invisible rules. Sometimes I looked at my father and wondered if this was how he had slowly disappeared too. By late February, I was counting down the days until my apartment would be ready again. I imagined turning the key in my own door, cooking in my own kitchen, letting my son laugh without looking over his shoulder. But life has a way of testing you just when you think you can endure a little longer. The house felt heavier with every passing week, like the walls themselves were listening. I didn't know it then, but these recordings I was quietly collecting would later become my lifeline. At that time, they were just a secret rebellion proof that I wasn't crazy. Vivian believed she was untouchable in that house. She thought no one would ever call her out. She thought my silence was weakness. But silence can hold power too. Sometimes silence is the sound right before the storm. December 14th of 2025 began like any other cold evening in Burlington, the kind where the windows fog at the edges and every creak in the house seems louder than it should be. We were finishing dinner when it happened. Ethan reached for the glass of milk on the edge of the table, his small fingers catching the rim, and it tipped. The milk spread across the tablecloth in a slow white river. He gasped instinctively, grabbing napkins, but before he could move, Vivian's eyes locked on him. It wasn't the kind of look people give children who make mistakes. It was sharp, almost hungry. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just said careless every single time and pushed her chair back slowly. Ethan froze like a rabbit under a hawk's shadow. I stood between them, grabbed the napkins, and said softly, "It's just milk. I'll clean it up." But the tension at that table was already building like a storm with nowhere to go. Vivian didn't say another word during dinner, but I could feel it radiating off her. That cold anger she carried whenever Ethan existed too loudly in her carefully controlled world. Robert sat quietly, his fork moving mechanically. He didn't meet my eyes. He never did in those moments. I took Ethan upstairs early. He brushed his teeth and climbed into bed wearing his navy pajama set, the one with the little bears on it. He mumbled an apology about the milk spill, eyes, wet voice, small. I knelt beside his bed and tucked the blanket around his shoulders, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You didn't do anything wrong," I whispered. "Accidents happen." He nodded, but I could tell the words didn't sink in. Living in that house had made him doubt even the smallest truths. I kissed his forehead and stayed a little longer than usual. Downstairs, I could hear the clink of glasses, Vivian's low voice, Robert's sighs. I told myself she would cool down, that she'd just stew in her bitterness like always. I was wrong. The house was dark when I opened my eyes again. I wasn't sure what woke me at first. It was a sound faint but sharp, like a gasp swallowed before it could escape. Then came a single muffled cry, the kind that doesn't belong in dreams. I threw back the blanket, my heart pounding in a rhythm that made the silence between sounds unbearable. I stepped into the hallway, the air cold against my skin. Another sound followed, a choked whimper. I knew it immediately. A mother knows. Ethan. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. The faint nightlight from his room spilled under the door. I reached it just as I heard the sharp intake of his breath, and then the snap. A sound I will never forget. It was small but clear. It sliced through the house. My hand flew to the doorknob. I pushed the door open, and the sight that met me burned itself into the back of my mind. Vivian was standing beside his bed. Her silhouette cut against the nightlight, her face calm, her hand still clutching Ethan's small wrist. Ethan was twisted slightly away from her, his little body rigid, his mouth open in a soundless scream before it finally broke into a cry that ripped through the room. She had bent his arm at a wrong angle, deliberate, controlled like someone who had thought about it. His pajama sleeve was bunched up at his elbow and his small hand trembled. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The world narrowed to the sound of Ethan's sobs and the sharpness of my breath. Then she looked at me. Her mouth curved upward, slow and cold. She didn't look startled. She didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied. And then she said it. He deserved it. Time stopped. There are moments in life that rip everything you believed about control away from you. That was mine. I lunged forward, pulling Ethan out of her grip. His body was shaking, hot tears soaking into my shoulder as he whimpered against me. His arm hung limp at a sickening angle. I pressed my cheek against his hair, whispering that it was going to be okay, even though my voice shook with rage. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. If I did, I don't know what I would have done. I turned toward the hallway, shouting over Ethan's cries, "Robert!" But when he appeared, he wasn't running. He wasn't panicked. He came out of the bedroom in his robe, like a man waking up to a leaky faucet, blinking slowly, pretending confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, voice thick with forced surprise. I screamed, "Call 911!" He just stared for a moment, his eyes flicking between Vivian and me. She had already walked out of the room, calm, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve like nothing had happened. I shifted Ethan carefully, cradling him against me. His breathing was ragged, every inhale sharp, every exhale broken. I stumbled toward my room where my phone was on the nightstand. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was steady and practiced. 911, what's your emergency? My son, I said, my voice shaking but clear. His arm is broken. She did it. Ma'am, is he breathing? Yes. Yes. But his arm. Please hurry. Stay calm. I'm dispatching an ambulance now. Can you tell me if there is any bleeding? No, it's his arm. It's bent. Okay, don't try to move it. Keep him still. Help is on the way. The words spilled from her in a steady rhythm, and for a second, I clung to them like a rope in a storm. I crouched on the floor with Ethan in my arms, whispering to him, you're safe, even though a part of me knew he hadn't been safe for a long time. Vivian sat on the living room couch when the sirens finally painted the street outside in red and blue. She didn't hide. She didn't cry. She just crossed one leg over the other and watched through the front window like someone waiting for a taxi. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, his hand gripping the railing. He didn't move toward me. He didn't move toward Ethan. The paramedics rushed in their flashlights, cutting through the shadows. They asked me questions in low, urgent voices. I told them what I could between Ethan's cries. One of them knelt beside him, immobilizing his arm with practiced hands. The other kept talking to me, grounding me, telling me we were doing the right thing. I heard Vivian say something from the couch. I don't remember the exact words, but it was soft and dismissive. Something about children being clumsy. One of the paramedics glanced at her and then at me, and I knew he didn't believe a word she said. As they lifted Ethan onto the stretcher, he reached for me with his uninjured hand. His fingers wrapped around mine with desperate strength. "Don't let her," he whispered, and I felt something inside me harden into steel. I walked beside him as they carried him out, snow crunching under their boots, cold air biting at my face. The flashing lights made the house behind me look like it was on fire. Robert stood in the doorway, hands in the pockets of his robe, eyes down. Vivian was still sitting still, smirking faintly. In that moment, any illusion that this was just a difficult family situation shattered completely. This wasn't tension. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was cruelty. Chosen, deliberate cruelty. As the ambulance doors shut and the siren wailed to life, I pressed Ethan's hand to my chest. I whispered to him that he was safe now, even though I was trembling so hard I could barely get the words out. I looked back once through the small window of the ambulance. Vivian's figure in the doorway was small, but her smile wasn't. It was the kind of smile that says I'm not afraid of consequences. That night, she thought she still owned the story. She didn't know yet how wrong she was. The night air bit at my skin as the paramedics carried Ethan into the ambulance. His arm was already immobilized in a temporary splint, but every bump in the driveway made him wince and cling tighter to my hand. His cries had grown softer not because the pain was gone, but because he was too exhausted to keep fighting it. One of the medics spoke calmly to me, his voice low but firm, as if holding the entire night together with words. He told me to stay right beside him to keep talking to my son. Ethan's breath hitched each time the ambulance swayed his tears, soaking into my coat sleeve. I brushed the hair from his forehead and whispered over and over, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." The back doors closed with a heavy thud, and the sirens roared to life, slicing through the frozen quiet of the neighborhood. I caught one last glimpse through the small back window. Vivian was still on the porch, arms crossed, her robe pulled tight, her chin lifted like nothing about this night concerned her. Robert stood behind her, a shadow in the doorway, hands in his pockets. They didn't follow us. They didn't even move. The paramedics worked quickly, checking Ethan's vitals, keeping pressure steady around the splint. One of them gently asked what had happened. I told them, my voice trembling but clear, that Vivian had grabbed his arm, twisted it, that he had screamed before I got there. The medic nodded, expression carefully neutral. He didn't question me, but he didn't say anything either. The silence in those moments was its own kind of storm. When we reached the emergency entrance of University of Vermont Medical Center, a team was already waiting. I had walked through these doors hundreds of times as a nurse, but never like this. This time, I wasn't in scrubs. I wasn't the one calming someone else's fear. This time, I was the mother running alongside a gurney. Ethan's small face was pale and damp with tears. His lower lip trembled as he tried to be brave the way little boys sometimes think they have to. They wheeled him into a brightly lit trauma room, the kind I knew too well. The beeping monitors, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the blur of nurses and doctors moving around us. Everything was both familiar and unbearable. I stood at the head of the bed, holding his uninjured hand. He looked at me with wide, glassy eyes, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Did I do something wrong?" The words cracked something inside me. I leaned closer, pressing my forehead to his, my throat burning. "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. Nothing." He didn't believe it, not completely. That was the damage she had done long before she ever touched him that night. A doctor examined the arm carefully, his voice calm and clinical, explaining things as he worked. There was swelling and a visible deformity. They needed X-rays to confirm the break, and then an orthopedic team would set it properly. They administered pain medication, and I felt Ethan's grip on my hand loosen slightly as the worst of the agony ebbed into a fog. Then the door opened and 2 police officers stepped in. One was a young woman with dark hair tied in a tight bun, the other an older man with the quiet, watchful eyes of someone who had seen too much. The female officer introduced herself as Officer Rachel Daniels. She explained gently that they needed to take initial statements. I told her they could ask me anything as long as I didn't have to let go of Ethan's hand. She nodded. The older officer said they'd already spoken with Vivian briefly at the house. She told them, "He fell. Kids are clumsy." I laughed once sharply without meaning to. "He fell," I said louder than I intended. She twisted his arm in his own bed. He screamed, and she said he deserved it. Rachel didn't flinch. She just opened a small notebook and began to write. "Did anyone else witness the event? My father was in the house," I said. "He claimed he didn't see anything." She glanced at the older officer. They'd heard that line before. She asked about previous incidents. I hesitated only for a moment before pulling my phone from my pocket. I had recordings, not of the attack, but of everything leading up to it, the insults, the rules, the way she talked about my son as if he were a problem to be fixed or erased. I handed her the phone and said, "I've been recording for months." Rachel's eyes softened almost imperceptibly, the kind of reaction police give when they realize a parent has been living in quiet fear, long before the night they finally call for help. While Ethan was taken for X-rays, they led me to a small consultation room just outside the trauma bay. It was quiet there, too quiet after the chaos. I could still hear his soft crying echoing in my chest. Rachel played a few of the recordings on low volume. Vivian's voice filled the sterile little room. "You let him act like this because you're weak. That boy is a mistake. He doesn't belong here." She said these things with the same cold control she'd shown every day. And now they were no longer just my memories. They were evidence. Rachel asked if I feared for Ethan's safety in the home. I didn't hesitate. Yes, I don't trust her near him again. The older officer asked if Vivian had ever laid hands on him before. I shook my head. Not like this, but words can do damage too. He nodded slowly. A woman from Child Protective Services arrived shortly after wearing a dark blue sweater and carrying a leather bag full of paperwork. Her name was Karen Adams. She explained in calm, practiced tones that their priority was Ethan's safety. She asked if I was willing to provide temporary alternate housing. I told her we already had an apartment waiting once the contractors finished repairs in January. She told me we might not even wait that long. When Ethan returned from X-ray, his arm wrapped in temporary support, his eyelids heavy from medication, I sat beside his bed and smoothed the blanket over him. The orthopedic resident came in showing me the films on a tablet. It was a clear, mid-shaft fracture of the radius and ulna. Clean, but deliberate. The resident didn't say it out loud, but I saw the look in his eyes. Accidents look different. The police and CPS coordinated outside the room, their voices low but serious. I could hear fragments, protective order, statement, arrest, evidence. It was surreal listening to these words about the same house where my son had once built blanket forts. Rachel returned with a few more questions. She asked if I wanted to make an official statement tonight. I said yes. I wanted every word on record. She handed me a clipboard. My handwriting was shaky but legible. I wrote it all. The milk spill, the scream, the words she said, the months of quiet cruelty. I didn't censor a thing. Sometime after 4 a.m, while the nurses were adjusting Ethan's IV and the orthopedic team prepared the cast, I stepped out into the hallway to catch my breath. The hospital hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of machines. It smelled like disinfectant and snow carried in on boots. I leaned against the wall and let the cold reality of it all settle over me. Vivian had attacked my son. My father had stood by. And now there were police reports and evidence logs and court words hovering in the air like ghosts. I returned to Ethan's side just as they were finishing the cast. His small arm was now wrapped in white plaster, a permanent reminder of the night that would change everything. He blinked up at me, still half-drugged, but aware enough to whisper, "Am I in trouble?" The words nearly knocked the air out of me. "No, sweetheart. You are not in trouble." "She is." His brow furrowed like he was trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense anymore. Rachel came back one last time. She explained that an officer was already at the house with Vivian. They would be taking her in for questioning. She didn't say arrest yet, but the weight of the word hung in the air. She told me they would also contact my father. My stomach twisted. I already knew which side he'd take. Karen from CPS assured me that Ethan would not be going back to that house. They would expedite a temporary custody arrangement so that I could keep him with me. No contact order would be filed within the next 24 hours. The words were clinical, but I heard the promise inside them. She would not touch my son again. When the sun began to rise, soft winter light filtering through the blinds, Ethan was finally asleep. His little hand rested on top of the blanket, fingers curled around the edge of his stuffed rabbit, which one of the nurses had retrieved from the ambulance. I sat there watching him breathe the machines, beeping steadily, the world both quieter and louder than it had ever been. In that moment, I felt the anger settle into something sharper, something steady. It wasn't rage anymore. It was purpose. Would you believe her or the stepmom? Drop your thoughts below. The investigation began before the sun fully set the next day. The police did not waste time. Neither did Vivian. By the time I had walked Ethan out of the hospital with his arm wrapped in plaster and a small stuffed dinosaur tucked under his other arm, she had already hired a lawyer. It didn't surprise me. Vivian lived her entire life as if the world owed her protection. The moment accountability got close, she wrapped herself in the armor of money and confidence. Her attorney's name was Michael Lawson, a sharp man with a polished smile, the kind who could make poison sound like perfume. He issued a statement through her almost immediately claiming the whole thing was a tragic accident that Ethan had fallen, and that I, an emotional and overprotective mother, was twisting things out of proportion. When the police showed up at the house to continue their investigation, Robert was there not beside his grandson, but beside his wife. He told the officers it must have been a misunderstanding. He said Vivian would never hurt a child. He used the word never as if he could rewrite the night by saying it with enough conviction. The detectives weren't interested in family theater. They went through every inch of Ethan's room. They examined the floor, the bed, the angles, the way the nightlight cast shadows across the hallway. They measured where Ethan had been found and how the arm had been broken. It didn't add up to a fall. Broken arms from falls have patterns. I had seen enough in the ER to know. They knew too. Their report later noted no supporting evidence of an accidental fall. Then they began talking to neighbors. The house wasn't isolated. Winter nights carried sound easily, and people had heard things. I remember sitting at the temporary apartment a few days later when one of the officers called me to give an update. Multiple neighbors had reported hearing Vivian yelling at Ethan on more than one occasion. One neighbor recalled an afternoon in November when Vivian screamed at him in the yard for leaving a soccer ball near the garden. Another mentioned hearing sharp words through the open kitchen window, followed by the sound of something slamming. She had always kept her cruelty wrapped neatly behind closed doors, but sometimes cruelty leaks out. Child Protective Services moved quickly once those interviews came in. Karen Adams, the same woman from the hospital, became the lead on Ethan's case. She explained to me in a calm and steady voice that they were filing for an emergency protection order. Vivian would not be allowed to contact Ethan under any circumstances until the legal process was complete. Robert, as her husband, was also under scrutiny. He hadn't laid a hand on Ethan, but silence can be its own kind of violence, and they wanted to understand how long he had ignored what was happening in his own house. The police continued building their case. They subpoenaed medical records, compared the fracture with typical childhood injuries, and consulted orthopedic specialists who confirmed what we already knew. The injury pattern didn't match a fall. It matched a controlled, forceful twist. When they asked Ethan what happened, they did it in a quiet room at the Howard Center with a trained child interviewer. I wasn't allowed inside, but I waited just outside the door, my stomach in knots. When he came out, his eyes were red, but he climbed into my lap and wrapped his good arm around my neck. I didn't ask him what they had said. I didn't need to. I knew. I moved out of my father's house within 48 hours of that night. I packed everything into boxes while Robert stood in the doorway saying nothing. Vivian didn't show her face. Maybe she was meeting with her lawyer. Maybe she was just avoiding me. Maybe she didn't care. I didn't care either. Ethan and I moved into a small rental apartment on the edge of Burlington. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, drafty windows, the kind of place where the pipes creaked at night. But when I locked that door behind us for the first time in months, I could breathe without wondering who might be standing in the hallway waiting to tighten their grip on my life. Ethan began therapy the following week. The Howard Center had a child trauma specialist named Dr. Megan Carter. She was warm but steady, the kind of person who knew how to make a frightened child feel like the world wasn't closing in around them. She didn't push him to talk about that night. She started with simple things. Drawing. Breathing exercises, gentle questions about how he felt when someone yelled. Slowly, I watched him begin to find the language to describe fear. I sat in the waiting room each session with a cup of stale coffee, staring at the clock, feeling the slow grind of time. Healing doesn't happen fast. But it was happening. The police interviews continued for weeks. I gave my statement 3 more times, each one more detailed than the last. They wanted timelines, exact phrases, descriptions of Vivian's voice. I gave them everything. I played the recordings I had taken during those months in the house. They listened to her say things like, "That boy is a mistake. She should have left him with his father." They listened to her set impossible rules and mock a 7-year-old for not being perfect. Rachel Daniels, the officer who had been with us from the beginning, told me privately that the recordings were damning. She said Vivian had clearly established a pattern of emotional abuse long before the physical violence. Vivian's lawyer tried to discredit me early on. He painted me as an unstable single mother with a chip on her shoulder. He suggested I fabricated recordings. He claimed my son's injury was an unfortunate accident twisted by emotion and bitterness. But the evidence kept stacking up. There was no fall pattern. There were witness statements. There were months of recordings. There was Ethan's quiet but unwavering statement given to trained professionals. CPS held a formal meeting at the end of December. It was me, my attorney, their representatives, and officers from the Burlington Police Department. Karen explained the plan clearly. Ethan would remain with me under protective custody. Vivian would have no contact. A restraining order would be filed in court. Robert could request supervised visitation only if he agreed to undergo an assessment. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that my father needed to be assessed to be near his grandson, or the fact that part of me no longer trusted him to do the right thing anyway. The days blurred together as winter settled deeper over Vermont. Snow fell outside the apartment windows in thick, soft sheets muffling the world. Inside, Ethan began to talk a little more each day. He laughed once when we built a lopsided gingerbread house. It wasn't a big laugh, but it was real, and it filled the tiny kitchen with a warmth the house on Maplewood Drive had never had. I slept lightly, listening for any sound that might mean trouble, even though I knew she couldn't reach us now. Trauma makes you listen for ghosts even after they're gone. In early January, the police served Vivian with formal charges, aggravated assault, and child endangerment. The look on her face, captured by a local reporter as she walked out of the courthouse behind her lawyer, was one I'd seen before. Controlled, composed, like someone who believed she was untouchable. But now she was wearing a coat over the cracks. The world was seeing them for the first time. Robert tried calling me that week. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, his voice was tired. He said he didn't know what to do, that he loved us both, that this was all a big misunderstanding. I deleted the message. There was no misunderstanding left. There was a broken arm. There was a boy who still woke up some nights crying without fully knowing why. There was a woman who had smiled when she hurt him. Ethan's therapy sessions became the anchor of our weeks. Dr. Carter slowly helped him name what happened, not in adult terms, but in a way he could hold without drowning in it. She helped me too in ways I hadn't expected. She told me something one day as I waited for him in the hallway. Children who survive trauma do not need perfect parents. They need present ones. I held on to those words like they were oxygen. The investigation reached its turning point when the medical reports were finalized and the forensic evidence confirmed deliberate force. That gave the prosecutors the confidence to move the case forward. Vivian's lawyer began to soften his tone, publicly still spinning, but less certain. Control is powerful when it's invisible. Once it's dragged into the light, it begins to rot. In the quiet of those winter nights, I would sometimes sit on the small couch in our apartment, listening to the radiator hum, watching Ethan sleep on the other side of the wall. His cast was covered in doodles from nurses and therapists, a messy collage of love over injury, and I would think about how small moments stack up into the kind of storm that either breaks you or builds you into something harder. The lines were drawn now. Vivian had her lawyer and her smirk. Robert had chosen silence. I had my son, the truth, and the law moving in slow, steady steps. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the tide turning in our favor. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was movement, and sometimes movement is the beginning of survival. The morning of the hearing was bitter cold, the kind of winter day when the air burns your lungs if you breathe too deeply. Snow crunched beneath the shoes of people filing into Chittenden County Superior Court, their breaths visible in the pale light. I held Ethan's small hand carefully as we walked up the courthouse steps, his cast long since removed, but his fingers still curling into mine for comfort. He wasn't going inside. The child advocacy team had recorded his testimony days earlier away from the noise and cruelty of the courtroom, but I wanted him to see that we were showing up, that the truth wasn't hiding anymore. Karen from CPS waited at the door, a reassuring figure wrapped in a thick wool coat, her face set in that calm professional expression that somehow always made me feel less alone. She took Ethan to the children's waiting area while I went through the metal detectors. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it against the inside of my ribs. Inside the courtroom was crowded. Reporters with notepads, neighbors whispering people from town who had read the story in the Burlington Free Press. The case had already spread beyond the neighborhood. People knew. They knew about Vivian, about the boy she said deserved it, about the broken arm in the night. I spotted familiar faces in the gallery, people who once smiled politely at her during holiday parties, now whispering behind their hands. It was a small town. People talk. But now they were listening to more than gossip. Vivian arrived a few minutes later. She walked into that courtroom like she owned it. Her lawyer, Michael Lawson, walked slightly ahead of her, holding a neat stack of folders. Vivian wore a dark gray suit and a pearl necklace, her hair pulled into a polished twist. Her expression was perfectly composed, almost serene. It was the same face she'd worn the night she hurt Ethan. She still believed she was untouchable. Robert followed behind her, moving slower, looking smaller. His suit was a little too big at the shoulders, his gaze fixed somewhere near the floor. But when he glanced up and saw me sitting at the prosecution's side, his eyes flickered with something between guilt and defiance. The judge, a woman with a sharp voice and sharper eyes, entered. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose, then sat again in silence, broken only by the shuffle of paper. The prosecutor, Rebecca Cole, rose from her chair. She was known in town for her meticulous preparation. She began with a calm opening statement describing the night of December 14th, the physical evidence, the recorded history of emotional abuse. Lawson countered with his own opening, painting Vivian as a misunderstood stepmother who loved her stepson but was being vilified by an overprotective daughter. He spoke with a polished rhythm, trying to make cruelty sound like a misunderstanding. But no amount of polish could change what was about to come. Rebecca called the first witness the orthopedic surgeon who had treated Ethan. He described the break in clinical detail, showing the X-ray and CT scans on a screen before the jury. He explained that the injury was not consistent with a fall. It required controlled force. Lawson tried to chip away at his testimony, suggesting that maybe Ethan had twisted it himself, maybe fallen against the bed frame. The surgeon didn't waver. His voice was steady, firm, professional. The evidence was clear. Then came the recordings. Rebecca queued them up one after another. Vivian's voice filled the courtroom, cold and precise, captured over weeks and months of cruelty. "That boy is a mistake. She should have left him with his father. Boys who don't show respect end up like their useless fathers." The words echoed in the chamber like a blade dragging against tile. I watched the faces in the gallery shift. People who once thought of her as elegant or charming were hearing her for who she really was. The whispers grew quieter. The weight of truth has a way of pulling silence into a room. Rebecca then played a short clip from Ethan's recorded statement. The screen was lowered, and there he was, sitting in a small interview room with soft lighting. His little voice filled the air, fragile but clear. "She hurt me when I was sleeping." A collective inhale moved through the courtroom like a wave. Even Lawson shifted slightly in his seat. Vivian didn't move. She stared straight ahead, chin high, as if the words of a 7-year-old couldn't touch her. But they did. I saw it in the tightening of her jaw. When Robert was called to the stand, I felt my stomach knot. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped together. Rebecca questioned him first. She asked what he remembered from that night. He said he heard nothing. He said he was asleep. She asked him if Vivian had ever been cruel to Ethan before. He said no. Lawson nodded approvingly beside him. Then Rebecca pressed play on a single recording. His own voice filled the room, tired and quiet, but unmistakable. "Just don't make a scene." It was from the night Ethan cried after she threw away his stuffed rabbit. Robert's face paled. He stammered something about not wanting conflict. Rebecca's voice remained steady. "You didn't want conflict, but you heard it, didn't you? You knew." Lawson objected, claiming badgering, but the judge overruled him. The jury saw everything they needed in that moment. A father who chose silence, a woman who chose cruelty, a boy who never got a choice. Rebecca called neighbors next. They told the court about hearing Vivian yelling through open windows, about seeing Ethan flinch when she spoke to him in the yard, about her snapping at him for something as small as a soccer ball. One woman said she had always felt uneasy watching them, like something was off. No one said anything then, but they were saying it now. Local reporters scribbled furiously. A photographer captured Vivian's expression when the recordings played. The story spread quickly online, small-town news turning into something bigger. The words she had spoken in the shadows were being printed in headlines. Vivian finally took the stand on the third day. She walked up slowly, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. Lawson guided her with gentle questions, letting her paint herself as the devoted stepmother who was misunderstood. She spoke softly with deliberate pauses, glancing at the jury like someone who expected to be believed. She said Ethan had been clumsy, that I was unstable, that this was all a terrible twist of events. She even managed to squeeze out a few tears. But Rebecca was ready. She pulled out one of the recordings and asked, "Is this your voice?" Vivian nodded stiffly. Rebecca played it again. "That boy is a mistake." Vivian shifted in the chair. Rebecca didn't yell. She didn't need to. She asked calmly, "Is that how you speak to children you love?" The silence in the room was deafening. Then came the most powerful moment. Rebecca replayed Ethan's small voice saying, "She hurt me when I was sleeping." Vivian exhaled sharply, almost like a hiss. It was the first time her polished mask cracked. It was small but unmistakable. A juror in the front row shook her head slowly. When the closing arguments began, Rebecca stood in front of the jury with her hands clasped in front of her. "This is not about an accident," she said. "This is about a woman who believed she could harm a child in the dark and walk away untouched. This is about a child who thought pain was something he deserved." She let the words hang in the air before walking back to her seat. Lawson spoke of misunderstandings, of family tension, of accidents, but his words no longer had weight. Not after the evidence, not after Ethan's voice. When the judge dismissed everyone for the day, Vivian stood, her composure shaken but not gone. Robert avoided my eyes as they walked past me. Reporters swarmed the hallway. I heard fragments of their questions. "Did she do it? How's the boy? How does the family respond?" I didn't answer. Outside the courthouse, the cold hit my lungs like ice. People who used to smile politely at Vivian now whispered with something close to disgust. She wasn't the elegant woman from neighborhood parties anymore. She was the woman who broke a child's arm. Should she face jail time? What would justice mean to you? A month after the verdict, when the town's whispers had quieted to a steady hum, the letter came. It arrived folded inside a plain white envelope, my name written in Vivian's neat, controlled handwriting. It was strange how even her penmanship mirrored her personality, tight, precise, leaving no room for warmth. I found it wedged among bills and appointment reminders, the only thing in the mailbox that seemed to hum with something heavier. I didn't open it right away. I sat at the small kitchen table of our apartment, sunlight spilling through the frosted window. Ethan's laughter faintly drifting in from the other room where he was building a block tower. I stared at her name for a long time, my fingers tightening around the paper until the edges curled. I already knew what it would say. People like Vivian didn't apologize because they felt remorse. They apologized because they wanted control back. When I finally opened the letter, it began exactly the way I expected. "Clara." I didn't mean it. I was under stress. He provoked me. She had written those words like they were a confession wrapped in justification. She claimed the situation had been blown out of proportion, that she was misunderstood, that she was still family and shouldn't be erased over one mistake. She never called what she did violence. She called it a moment, a lapse, a misunderstanding, as if a broken bone could be reduced to an unfortunate slip of language. She even mentioned my father, saying he was worried that this had torn the family apart. She wrote that she hoped for reconciliation. That word alone made my skin crawl. 2 days later, Robert called. It was the first time he had used my number since the trial began. His voice was thin and uneven, like a man caught between two collapsing walls. "Clara," he said, "we need to talk." I stood at the kitchen sink phone pressed to my ear, staring out at the gray sky over Burlington. He told me Vivian had been meeting with her lawyer, that she wanted to speak with me, that maybe we could find a way to put this behind us. He said the words like they were reasonable, like what happened was a family argument instead of an assault on a child. I asked him plainly, "Dad, do you understand what she did?" He went quiet. Then he said something that made my chest tighten in disbelief. "She didn't mean it. She lost control. It happens." I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle into me. "No," I said slowly. "It happens when people choose cruelty over decency." And she chose it. He tried again, softer, more desperate this time. "She's your stepmother. She's my wife. She's the woman who broke your grandson's arm," I said. The line was silent for a long time before he whispered, "Can't we just fix this?" There was no fixing this. There was no middle ground. I told him as much. I told him if he wanted to have a relationship with Ethan, it would never again involve Vivian. If he couldn't accept that, then he would live with the silence he had chosen the night of the attack. I hung up before he could say another word. A week later, the court scheduled a post-sentencing hearing to review the protective orders and finalize certain civil matters tied to the criminal conviction. It was supposed to be procedural. It wasn't supposed to hurt, but it did. Because Vivian was there. She was brought in wearing a beige sweater and neatly pressed pants, looking more like a PTA president than someone convicted of harming a child. Her lawyer hovered near her like a shadow. Her hair was still perfectly arranged, her expression soft, calculated. She didn't look like someone who had spent nights replaying her cruelty. She looked like someone who thought she could still rewrite the story. They seated me on one side of the courtroom and her on the other. My attorney leaned close, reminding me that this was just a hearing. Nothing she said could change the sentence. But I already knew this wasn't about the sentence. This was about her reaching for a final threat of power. When the judge entered, Vivian stood and asked to address the court. Her lawyer nodded solemnly like this was all some tragic misunderstanding. She began her statement in that calm, measured voice I'd come to know too well. She said she was sorry for what happened. She said she'd never meant to hurt anyone. She said she loved Ethan. She said he'd provoked her that night by being disrespectful. She didn't use the words broken arm. She didn't use the words violence or cruelty. She wrapped her actions in soft, shapeless language, trying to sand down the sharp edges of what she had done. The judge listened without interrupting. Vivian even cried at one point, pressing a folded handkerchief to the corner of her eye. I recognized the performance for what it was. She wasn't crying for what she did. She was crying for what she lost. Control. Status. The mask she had worn so perfectly for so long. Then she turned toward me. "Clara," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to sound human. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I lost control. I hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't look away. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel shaken. I didn't feel cornered. I felt steady. "No," I said quietly, clear enough that even the people in the back row could hear. "I will never forgive what you did to my son, and neither will he." Then the bailiff opened the side door. They had arranged for Ethan to be present briefly, not in the courtroom itself, but in the adjoining room with a viewing panel, just to review the renewal of the protective order. He was older in ways that had nothing to do with months passing. He walked in with Karen beside him, holding his small backpack in one hand. Vivian's eyes lit up at the sight of him like she thought she could still pull him back into the orbit she'd burned. She stepped forward just half a step and said his name softly. Ethan froze. His good hand clutched Karen's jacket. She extended her arms slightly as if to embrace him. He flinched backward. His whole body stiffened, his face draining of color. It was instinct raw and unfiltered. That single step he took away from her was louder than any testimony. I saw her face falter for the first time, a small crack forming in the mask she had built for years. Her hands lowered slowly. She whispered something I couldn't hear. I walked toward Ethan, standing between them without needing to say a word. He pressed against my side, the warmth of his small frame anchoring me. I turned to her and said clear and steady, "You taught me exactly what I'll never let my son live with again." Her mouth opened slightly as if she'd expected something else. But there was nothing else to give. The judge finalized the orders swiftly. Permanent no contact between Vivian and Ethan. Restricted communication with me only through legal counsel. The sentence she had already received remained intact with no adjustments. But the legal outcome wasn't the most powerful part of that day. The most powerful part was watching Ethan choose distance. Watching him claim, even wordlessly, that her power over him was gone. After the hearing, I stepped outside into the crisp air. The sky was the same flat gray it had been the day of the verdict, but something was different. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. Robert tried calling again that evening. I let the phone ring until it stopped. His silence that night had built a wall between us neither of us could tear down. Vivian's letter sat in my desk drawer for weeks after that. I never responded. I never sent it back. One night when the snow was falling in lazy spirals outside and Ethan was asleep, I lit a match and watched the edges curl into black ash in a small metal bowl. Her words turned into smoke, and for the first time, the air in that apartment felt clean. She had written, "I didn't mean it," but she did. And now she was the one standing outside the walls of a life she could no longer touch. March of 2026 arrived with the last stubborn patches of snow melting on the sidewalks of Burlington. The town had changed since that winter night when everything broke open. Or maybe it was me who had changed. The courthouse that once felt like a battlefield now felt like a closing chapter. Reporters still lined the steps that morning, their breath clouding in the cold air, their cameras trained on the entrance like they were waiting for something cinematic. But this wasn't a story to me anymore. It was my life, and I was here to watch it finally settle. Vivian stood in the defendant's box wearing a beige prison jumpsuit. Her hair was still pulled back, but the polish was gone. The color of the walls seemed to swallow her presence rather than amplify it the way it had during the trial. Her lawyer was there less confident than he had been months earlier, flipping through a binder that would no longer change anything. The evidence was stacked high and solid. The conviction was already in place. This was the sentencing. The judge's voice carried through the room with deliberate clarity. Aggravated assault on a child, intentional harm resulting in permanent psychological trauma, emotional abuse documented and corroborated, 12 years in state prison with no eligibility for parole before serving at least 10. The words hit the air like cold steel. Vivian's face didn't crumble, it tightened. That was who she was. Someone who met consequences with calculation rather than remorse. But for the first time, calculation meant nothing. Robert sat 2 rows behind her. His suit was wrinkled, his hair grayer than before, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of every choice he didn't make had finally caught up to him. He hadn't spoken to me in weeks. After the letter, after the plea, after the hearing where Ethan recoiled from Vivian, the distance between us had solidified into something colder than silence. When the judge turned to address the matter of visitation rights, the courtroom quieted. The motion was clear. Given his failure to act, given his complicity through silence, Robert Whitmore was stripped of any unsupervised contact with his grandson. If he ever wanted to rebuild that bridge, it would have to be under strict court supervision and through CPS review. The words seemed to hollow him out. He didn't argue. He didn't even look up. When the gavel struck, the story left the walls of the courtroom and spread into the town like wind through bare trees. Local news outlets were already posting headlines within the hour. Step-grandmother sentenced in child abuse case. 12-year sentence handed down in Burlington child assault. Some used Ethan's first name. Most didn't. They used words like step-grandmother harm, trauma sentencing. Clean words that never quite captured the sound a child makes when his arm breaks in the night. But people understood. The story wasn't gossip anymore. It was a warning. Community reaction was swift and unforgiving. Burlington wasn't a large city. People remembered who Vivian was at dinner parties, charity events, holiday gatherings. They remembered her smile, the pearls around her neck, the way she'd stood next to Robert and charmed strangers. Now they saw the monster behind the mask. I saw familiar faces in the grocery store whispering, not about me, but about her. I overheard someone say she'll never walk down Church Street without people turning their backs. Except she wouldn't be walking anywhere near Church Street for a long time. Meanwhile, Ethan and I began the quiet, complicated work of reclaiming our lives. His therapy sessions continued twice a week. His therapist said he was making progress, slow, steady progress. He had started playing soccer again with a local kids' league. The first time I saw him run across the field without flinching at the sound of someone shouting instructions, I almost cried. There were still nights when he woke up and asked if the door was locked, but they were fewer now. I filed a civil lawsuit against Vivian and Robert shortly after the sentencing. I wanted full separation from the family trust, full legal control over any financial entanglements that might give them leverage over us. I didn't want my son's future tied in any way to the people who had either hurt him or looked away when someone else did. The lawsuit was clean clinical, drawn up by a lawyer who had handled similar cases before. But behind every signature on those pages was something raw, a refusal to let them have even a sliver of control ever again. Robert didn't contest it. I think he knew there was nothing left to fight for. Vivian's assets were frozen pending restitution claims. The house where everything began was up for sale. The world that had once made her feel powerful was crumbling piece by piece, not because I shouted louder, but because the truth was louder than both of us. The day she was transferred to the state facility, I didn't go to the courthouse. I didn't want to see her board the transport van. But I saw the image later in the local paper, her wrists cuffed, head high, eyes locked on some invisible horizon. She still thought of herself as someone who could control the narrative. She didn't realize she no longer had a story to tell. Robert tried to call one last time. He left a voicemail I never returned. He said he missed Ethan. He said he'd made mistakes. But mistakes were what people called choices when they didn't want to face them. I couldn't hand my son back to the same silence that let him get hurt. That spring, the town's conversations shifted to other things. New stories, new headlines. But for those who had lived through the trial, who had sat in that courtroom or followed every article, the memory lingered. People stopped asking questions about what happened. They started nodding silently when they saw me at the coffee shop or in the hospital where I still worked night shifts. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to acknowledgement. They knew. For Ethan, justice didn't look like newspaper headlines or legal documents. It looked like soccer practice on a Saturday morning without fear. It looked like drawing in his therapy notebook with bright colors instead of dark smudges. It looked like laughter that didn't have to be forced. He would carry scars, emotional ones, but scars are proof that something tried to break you and failed. I learned something in those months that I'd never forget. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't roar like in the movies. It moves like water through rock, slow and relentless, carving a path whether anyone's watching or not. Vivian had 12 years to sit in a cell and think about the boy she called a mistake. She'd probably still twist the story in her mind, tell herself she was the victim, but she wasn't. She was just another person who thought cruelty was power until the world reminded her it wasn't. The house she and Robert had shared sat empty for months. A for sale sign went up in early summer. The grass grew wild around the edges of the property. The porch sagged a little more each week. No one wanted to buy the house everyone in town knew by its headline. Ethan and I didn't talk about her much after that. I answered his questions when they came simple, clear, never sugar-coated. He knew she was in prison. He knew she couldn't hurt him anymore. He knew in the way children know the truth without needing every word spelled out that our lives had moved beyond her shadow. The night the civil suit officially closed and the last paper was signed, I sat alone on the balcony of our small apartment. The air was cool, the sky clear. I thought about the girl I had been before Ethan was born, the woman I had been before that night in December, and the person I was now. A part of me would always carry the shape of that pain, but it no longer defined us. Burlington slept quietly around us. Vivian's story was over. Ours was still being written. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence didn't feel like fear. It felt like peace. A year passed quietly, not in the way years sometimes slip through your fingers unnoticed, but in the way time feels when it finally stops being a weapon. Vermont summers are short but gentle. By June of 2027, the air around Colchester carried that soft warmth that drifts through open windows in the early evening. The house I bought wasn't big. It had white shutters, a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, and a backyard that met a narrow trail leading to Lake Champlain. I'd walked past this street once during the darkest months of the trial, not even knowing that one day this would be home. Back then, home had felt like something fragile that could shatter overnight. Now, it was a place I'd built with steady hands. Ethan was 8 now, a little taller, his hair longer, and sun-bleached from afternoons spent outside. The cast was long gone, but he still had a faint white line across his right arm where the skin had stretched during recovery. It was a scar small but permanent, a quiet reminder of something neither of us could erase. But it didn't define him. What defined him now were the bursts of laughter that rolled out when he cannonballed into the lake, the way he ran barefoot through the grass, the way his shoulders relaxed when he realized no one was watching him with cruelty. We'd built new rituals together. Saturday mornings meant walking the lakeside trail with our shoes in our hands, feeling the wet earth between our toes. I'd bring a thermos of coffee and Ethan would bring his sketchbook. He liked to draw the water, the ducks, the boats, sometimes just shapes he said were how the lake sounds. His therapist said drawing was how he processed what words couldn't hold. I didn't push him to explain. I just sat beside him watching the sunlight bounce off the surface of the water, feeling the simple weight of quiet days. He was learning to swim now. At first, he hated the feeling of someone behind him and the water hands near him. He'd flinch when the instructor corrected his posture. But week after week, something in him began to unclench. One afternoon, he pushed away from the edge of the dock arms, cutting through the water on his own, his face breaking into a grin that caught me off guard. I found myself crying quietly, not from sadness, but from the enormity of watching him reclaim something piece by piece. Trauma doesn't disappear, but it makes space for joy when it's given time to breathe. My own healing had been slower, quieter. I'd returned to work at the hospital part-time, easing back into night shifts. The people who had followed the trial never asked about it directly. They just nodded or left warm cups of coffee at my station on long nights. The silence wasn't avoidance. It was respect. For once, my story wasn't something people whispered about at grocery stores. It had become something they silently honored. I learned to live without waiting for the phone to ring with bad news. I learned how it felt to lock my front door at night and know it was enough. The legal system had done what it was supposed to. Vivian was in prison. Robert had faded into the background of our lives, a shadow that no longer reached us. But healing didn't come from their absence. It came from the slow, deliberate building of a life they had no part in. One crisp October evening, I hung a set of wind chimes on the porch. They were made of smooth blue glass and copper, a gift from Ethan after his first art fair at school. He had pressed the wrapped box into my hands, face proud and shy at the same time. The first night I heard their soft ringing, it didn't sound like the house was empty. It sounded like it belonged to us. Ethan still asked questions sometimes, always at night, always softly, as if afraid the dark would swallow the answers. He asked why she hurt him. He asked why Grandpa didn't stop her. I didn't dress my answers in pretty lies. I told him the truth in pieces he could hold. I told him some people hurt others because they don't know love the way it's supposed to be. I told him his pain was real. I told him it was never his fault. He didn't need me to be perfect. He just needed me to be honest. There were still nights when he would stand at the threshold of my room, his hair sticking up in every direction, whispering, "Can I sleep here tonight?" I'd lift the blanket without saying a word, and he'd curl against me the way children do when they're still finding their way back to safety. Those nights weren't setbacks. They were proof that we were still healing, just slower than the calendar moved. I had learned something I wished I had understood sooner. Peace doesn't come in grand cinematic moments. It's not the gavel striking or the headline or the apology that never comes. Peace is the sound of your child breathing evenly in the dark. It's the softness of wind chimes on a quiet night. It's knowing you've built something no one can take from you again. 1 year after that night, I stood on the porch while Ethan slept inside. The air smelled like lake water and pine. The stars above Colchester glittered against a velvet black sky. I could hear the low hum of crickets and the faint sound of a boat engine somewhere far off. The wind chimes swayed gently, their music a soft rhythm that seemed to match the steady beat of my heart. I thought about everything that had happened, the courtrooms, the recordings, the way people used to look at me like I was either too strong or too broken. And now none of that mattered. We were just a mother and a son standing in the quiet aftermath of a storm that had finally passed. I went inside, careful not to make the floorboards creak. Ethan was asleep on his side, his arm resting over the stuffed fox he refused to let go of even after outgrowing toys. His hair fell across his forehead, his breath steady and warm. I sat on the edge of the bed, brushing the hair away from his face, and whispered softly, "You're safe now." The words didn't feel like a promise. They felt like a fact. For a long moment, I just sat there listening to the wind outside and the quiet inside. The pain hadn't vanished. It lived inside us like an old scar, something that didn't ache every day, but still remembered where it came from. But pain wasn't the loudest voice anymore. Peace was. And peace doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it a place to rest. Would you have forgiven her? Tell me below.